Here are 5 most looted countries in Africa. Come, let me show you to have a better understanding as to the Africa that you belong to. I would like to hear your thoughts as to these that have been said. So just come to the comment section and let me hear from you too. Please don't forget to
Subscribe
on this YouTube channel to get more updates as to African history. Thank you. During the colonial period, many African countries were heavily looted by European powers. Here are 5 of the most looted countries in Africa, along with brief details on their experiences. Number 1. Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. Under King Leopold II of Belgium, the Congo Free State, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, became one of the most looted and exploited territories in Africa. Leopold turned Congo into his personal colony, extracting vast amounts of rubber, ivory, and minerals. Millions of Congolese were forced into brutal labor, with estimates suggesting that around 10 million people died under his rule. The extraction of Congo's mineral wealth continues today, contributing to ongoing conflict and instability. 2. South Africa. South Africa was colonized by the Dutch and later the British, who exploited its vast mineral wealth. The discovery of diamonds and gold in the 19th century led to one of the most intense periods of looting and exploitation. Indigenous people were displaced and the wealth generated from South African natural resources fueled European economic growth, while the local population was subjected to extreme inequality and exploitation. 3. Nigeria. British colonization of Nigeria focused on extracting agricultural products such as palm oil, rubber, and granules, but also looted cultural artifacts. One of the most infamous incidents was in 1897 British Puniti expedition to Benin, during which the British looted thousands of priceless artifacts from the Benin Kingdom, many of which are now housed in European museums. The exploitation of Nigeria's oil resources after independence has continued to enrich foreign companies at the expense of local population. 4. Ghana, formerly known as the Gold Coast. Ghana was heavily exploited by the British for its gold reserves. For centuries, European powers traded in gold, ivory, and enslaved people along the coast of Ghana. The British established control over the region in late 19th century, focusing on the extraction of gold and other natural resources, which they transported back to Europe to fuel their industrial expansion. 5. Angola. Portugal exploitation of Angola was largely focused on its human and mineral resources. Angola was a major source of enslaved Africans for the transatlantic slave trade, with millions forcibly taken to the Americans. After slavery, Angola's rich oil and diamond resources were exploited. Even after independence, foreign interests continued to dominate Angola's resources sector, contributing to the prolonged civil conflicts fueled by the desire for control over its valuable resources. These countries experienced large-scale extraction of both human and natural resources, which significantly hindered their development and contributed to long-standing economic and social challenges. If you'd like to get more updates as to the good history in Africa
Subscribe
to this channel for more updates. Thank you. Let's look into the effect of the looting activities in these African nations. The looting of African nations during colonization had long-lasting devastating effects on their development, economies, and societies. Here are some of the key impacts on these African nations. Number 1. Economic exploitation and underdevelopment. Resources depletion. The extensive extraction of natural resources like gold, diamonds, and oil deprived African nations of the wealth that could have fueled their own economic developments. Colonizers took their resources back to Europe, benefiting European economies while leaving African countries impoverished. Monoculture economies. Colonial powers forced many African countries to rely on the extraction of a single or few resources, like rubber in Congo or gold in Ghana. This created weak, unbalanced economies, highly vulnerable to price fluctuations in global markets, leading to economic instability. Infrastructure development for extraction. The infrastructure built during colonization, such as railroads and ports, was designed solely for the purpose of transporting resources out of Africa. There was minimal investment in industrialization or in the development of infrastructure that would benefit local economies or population. 2. Social and cultural disintegration. Human exploitation. Millions of Africans were enslaved and forcibly removed from their countries, which decimated populations and led to the destructions of families and communities. The transatlantic slave trade severely disrupted societies, erasing cultural heritage and weakening political system. Cultural looting and loss of heritage. Colonial looting included the theft of African cultural artifacts, many of which were still housed in European museums. This not only deprived nations of their history, but also removed critical cultural marks that could have supported national identity and pride. Displacement and forced labor. Indigenous people were displaced from their lands to make way for resources extraction. In places like the Congo, forced labor system imposed by colonials led to millions of deaths and a culture of oppression, which was deeply scarred the population and social structure. 3. Political fragmentation and instability. Arbitrary borders. Colonial power drew borders without regard to ethnic, cultural, or historical division, grouping together different tribes or splitting communities across borders. This sowed the seeds for post-independence ethnic tension and conflicts in countries like Nigeria, Congo, and Angola. Destruction of traditional governance. Indigenous political systems were dismantled and replaced by colonial administrations, which often ruled through coercion and violence. This weakened traditional leadership structure and left post-colonial states with weak political foundations, leading to unstable governance after independence. Post-independence conflicts. The fight for control over resources, combined with a weak political system, left by colonizers led to civil wars and conflicts in countries like Angola, Congo, and Nigeria. These conflicts had prolonged poverty and instability in these nations. 4. Enduring poverty and inequality. Persistent economic inequality. The wealth generated by Africans' resources mostly benefited Europeans, colonizers, and foreign corporations, creating stark inequality that persists today. Many African nations are still struggling with poverty, with only a small elite benefiting from resource wealth, often in collaboration with foreign interests. Limited industrialized developments. Colonization focused on resource extraction rather than developing industries within African nations. As a result, many post-colonial states remained dependent on exploiting raw materials while importing finished goods, perpetuating economic dependence on foreign powers. 5. Environmental degradation, ecological destruction. The extraction of resources often led to large-scale environmental destruction, deforestation, soil degradation, and depletion of natural resources have had lasting effects on African ecosystems. In the Congo, for example, rubber extraction devastated local wildlife and forestry. Sustainability challenges. The overexploitation of natural resources left many African countries facing challenges related to environmental sustainability, making it harder for them to recover economically. The looting during colonization left many African countries impoverished, politically unstable, and socially fragmented. Many of these nations are still grappling with the consequences, including economic dependency, political instability, and social inequalities. These challenges continue to hinder their ability to fully recover and take advantage of their rich natural resources. Efforts to reclaim stolen cultural artifacts, renegotiate resource contracts, and address historical grievance remains critical for healing and progress. Here are some key ways the colonizers profited from their exploitation of Africa. The looting of African countries during the colonization significantly benefited the colonizers in numerous ways, shaping their economy, political, and cultural power. Here are some key ways the colonizer profited from their exploitation of Africa. 1. Economic enrichment. Resource extraction. Colonizers exploited Africa's vast natural resources such as gold, diamond, rubber, oil, and other valuable commodities. These resources were sent back to Europe and America, fueling the Industrial Revolution and economic growth. For instance, British, Belgian, French, and Portuguese economies greatly profited from Africa's minerals, agricultural products, and precious metals, leading to significant economic booms. Cheap or free labor. Colonizers imposed forced labor systems, particularly in industries like the rubber, mining, and agriculture. The transatlantic slave trade further enriched the colonizing powers by providing a steady source of free labor, particularly for plantations in the Americas. African labor contributed directly to the wealth and power of colonial empire without any compensation. Monopolization of trade. Colonizers established monopolies on African exports, ensuring that profit from African resources flowed to European or American corporations and governments. African colonies were often forced to buy finished products from their colonizers, enriching European industries by ensuring captive markets for their manufactured goods. 2. Industrial advancements. Raw materials for industrialization. Africa provided raw materials critical for the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Cotton from Africa fueled textile mills, while African minerals such as copper, tin, and diamond became key inputs in manufacturing industries, helping the industrial power like Britain and France to dominate global markets. Colonial infrastructure development in Europe. The wealth extracted from African colonies helped fund the development of infrastructure in Europe such as railways, ports, and factories. While African infrastructure was built solely for extraction purposes, European infrastructure flourished and supported the industrial growth of colonizing nations. 3. Cultural and scientific advancements. Stolen artifacts and knowledge. African cultural treasures and artifacts were looted and placed in European museums such as the British Museum and the Louvre in France and others. These artifacts boosted the cultural prestige of the colonizers and attracted international recognitions. Beyond artifacts, colonizers also appropriated African knowledge in areas like medicine, agriculture, and metallurgy, scientific exploration, and mapping. Colonizers used Africa as a frontier for scientific research and exploitation, mapping unknown regions, and conducting experiments that would later benefit European scientific communities. This exploitation of African land and people provided data that further advanced European knowledge and influence. 4. Political dominance and empire expansion. Global power and prestige. Control over African colonies allowed European nations to expand their empires, solidify their global power and influence. The scrabble for Africa during the late 19th and the early 20th century was a competition for prestige, with each colonizing country wanting to showcase its dominance through territorial expansion. The wealth and the resources from Africa blustered and nation positioned on the global stage. Military advantage. African colonies were used as strategic military bases and staging points for wars, particularly during both world wars. African soldiers were conscripted to fight in European wars, providing a military advantage to the colonizing power. Colonies were also a source of food and materials for European armies during conflicts. 5. Long-term economic influence and dependency. Economic dependency. Even after the end of former colonization, many African countries remained economically dependent on their former colonizers due to the structures imposed during the colonial rule. The colonizers often maintained control over Africans' resources through multinational corporations, foreign aid programs, and trade arrangements that continue to fuel wealth out of the Africa into Europe and America. Unequal trade relationships. Post-independent African countries often remain locked into unequal trade relationship with their former colonizers, exporting raw materials and importing finished products, which ensured that wealth continued to accumulate in Europe and America. 6. Cultural and political hegemony. Language and cultural influence. colonizers imposed their languages, religions, and cultural practices on African societies, establishing cultural hegemony that persists today. European languages such as English, French, and Portuguese became dominant in many African countries, which helped former colonizers maintain political and economic influence post-dependence. Political systems and governance. Colonizers exported their political system to Africa, establishing institutions that mirrored European model of governance. Many post-colonial African governments continued to rely on political frameworks set by their colonizers, which gave the former imperial power direct control over political development in the continents. In conclusion, the looting of Africa during colonization significantly enriched and strengthened the economies, political powers, and cultural prestige of European and American colonizers. These benefits include vast wealth from resources extraction, the industrial growth, military advantage, scientific advancement, and long-lasting economic dependency. While the colonizers profited immensely, African nations were left impoverished, underdeveloped, and grappling with long-term consequences of colonization.